Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the very first talk of the day. Clearly, you all didn't party too hard yesterday at the party, but even if you did, I really appreciate you coming out this morning to hear my talk, which is CVE 101. Just to start out, tell you a bit about myself. My name is Theresa Mammarella. I am a developer advocate at Sonatype. I've been in the Java space for about 5 years now, starting out my career doing JVM and compiler development, and I then pivoted into developer advocacy because I really wanted to be more part of creating pipelines for developer tools that have really good feedback, and that's the part that I'm trying to fill as a developer advocate. I've learned a lot of things since making that transition. One of those things, now working at a company that is very much focused on security, is how much as a developer I was really blind to this world of cybersecurity that I probably shouldn't have been quite as much. So I created this talk today to share a little bit about what I've learned and hopefully inspire you as well to think about how you can be a good advocate for security in your development jobs as well. So today, what we're going to talk about is going to go over some real basic terms when it comes to security, how vulnerability tracking and disclosure is done, and then what's a little bit newer that you should be thinking about in recent years, and the importance of thinking about things like good coding practices and dependency management. So starting with the basics, we're just going to get some terms out of the way. I'm sure you're all a little bit familiar with these terms: vulnerability, threat, and risk. They're often used a little bit interchangeably, even within the world of security, I've found out. But just to set the record straight, when we're talking about a vulnerability, that is some kind of weakness or a flaw in a system, and that can be something that is a technical flaw that is exploitable, or even a human flaw that can make potentially a developer or any sort of human susceptible to some kind of social engineering attack. Threat is the action of someone going out to actually exploit that vulnerability that may result in a loss, so the intent to do some harm. And finally, risk is the probability that some loss is going to happen. These three terms, like I said, it's common to hear them used a little bit interchangeably sometimes, but the way to think about how they are related together is threat and vulnerability together. The combination of those two things creates a risk for security. So having a vulnerability that exists is not really an issue unless there's an intent to do harm. Similarly, if there's no vulnerabilities that exist, an intent to do harm doesn't really help either. And so the goal with cybersecurity is really to mitigate this risk factor. As someone who doesn't control the entire world, I can't control if somebody attempts to do harm to me or any of my systems. So threat is something that is not a variable within my control. Vulnerability, on the other hand, maybe I can think about, okay, I can sort of try to have some idea of what this could entail to try to mitigate the risk as much as possible. And that is where the CVEs come in, is an idea to basically have a public record of all the vulnerabilities that exist so that we can all know, software developers, what common vulnerabilities there may be to mitigate them as much as possible. Do many of you know about CVEs and what this is? Okay, awesome. That's great to see. So as I mentioned, this is just a public way of going out and saying this is a vulnerability in some kind of system. There's always an ID. The first part of it is the year that it came out, some kind of description and a reference. Often the reference is something showing how an exploit can be done or talking a little bit about it. These are typically stored in what's known as the National Vulnerability Database. There are a few different databases that hold CVE data, but this is one that's really commonly used in a lot of security scanning tools that you'll see. Now, a limitation of the CVEs I mentioned before is they don't really give you a lot of context about how bad that vulnerability is, for example. So unless I know that certain system really well, or I'm a security expert, it might be kind of hard to figure out what to do with them or if I should care. And so the National Vulnerability Database takes that information and assigns a score, which is the CVSS score that you'll see right here. It goes from 0 to 10, 10 being the most critical vulnerability, meaning it can be very easily exploited. There's actually quite a lot that goes into this score that I've learned about. So the score that you'll see on the National Vulnerability Database is just this base score, one of 3 parts that goes into CVSS metrics. And the base score is based on inherent characteristics that don't change over time, and they're not due to a specific environment, typically. There's also these other scores that do take those into account. The time score, because the score could change over time, for example, depending on the level of remediation for that vulnerability. The environmental score is not something you'll really see in the public, because that is something more of a guideline for organizations to go and determine how does this apply to my specific environment and configurations. So these things, the CVE, CVSS, they're fairly commonly known and are tools to be able to discuss and communicate vulnerabilities. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and I think in most security talks you'll see, most security content, there's never really a happily ever after or a perfect solution to try to solve this, because as great as it is to go out and communicate to other developers that are building applications, hey, you should probably fix this vulnerability, at the same time you're also communicating to potential bad actors that may pose a threat to your system, the exact same thing, and waving a flag saying, hey, this package or this system is vulnerable, and maybe you can come exploit it. So as a result, there's actually quite a lot of controversy in the security world about how best to handle these types of communication. So one example that I thought was interesting, last summer there was a security researcher that found out that in this CVE, all the details are blanked out, so people can't go in and see it, but in the reference section, instead of just having a proof of concept, for example, or something explaining a vulnerability as a write-up, it actually had links to vulnerable systems that were using this vulnerability. And so this reporter, he went to the organization that had published this CVE, and he said, hey, I don't think this is right. Should you really be putting these organizations on blast? And they said, yeah, I don't know, we don't really have any rules against this and how we report a CVE. So surprisingly to me and to this reporter, this was something that was up for debate and not necessarily going to be fixed. And I think one common detail that a lot of us forget about CVEs is that they can really be filed by anyone, and there's not that much of a system for making sure that this data is necessarily good or reported in an ethical way. This was an example from this year where basically a student went and filed a CVE. Turned out that it didn't really have any basis and the research was a little bit faulty. This poor kid wanted to build up his resume and caused a bit of a fuss at my company, at least, by saying there was a vulnerability in one of our products. And so as you can imagine, this poor student saying, oh, so excited about my first CVE, kind of felt some backlash from the community there by not communicating the vulnerability properly. And that kind of leads me into the next part about CVEs that is a little bit different in talking about it, which is how it's disclosed. And there's a lot of different ways about talking and communicating about this, especially when it comes to finding vulnerabilities and talking to an organization about it to fix it. So there's 3 different ones that you'll typically hear about: private, coordinated, and public. So private, typically this will be done, say, with a bug bounty program where a researcher is actually getting something for their findings, because the downside of doing it privately is that they then have no sense of control about when or if the information that they found is going to be communicated back to the public. So private disclosure is essentially just reporting privately and then allowing that organization to do what they will. They may fix it, they may not. They may decide to communicate it, they may not. It's totally up to them. Coordinated disclosure is what was not done in that previous example I mentioned. And this is typically regarded as the responsible thing to do. In fact, you'll often hear this called responsible disclosure, but coordinated is now the preferred term because that word responsible is, of course, a little bit biased. And coordinated disclosure is when, instead of just sending this vulnerability to the organization and letting them do what they will, there's an agreement between the researcher and the organization. So they might disclose it privately to begin with, and then there'll be some kind of agreed upon timeline that, okay, you have to fix it by this day, and then we're going to talk about it in public, just to give some time there, so that whatever product there is not totally vulnerable if that CVE were to just go public right away. So you may be wondering, how does one actually go out and disclose this type of thing? And so, I mean, as I think most of you are not security researchers in the room, likely developers, this is probably something your organization have, but if you're, for example, running an open source project, this is something to think about as well. So typically, organizations have instructions on their websites for how to disclose security vulnerabilities properly. For open source projects, more and more there's security MD files that are there. And a lot of projects are pretty good about this, but a lot also aren't. So something to keep in mind as you're developing potentially open software. Often there's also security sort of text files on a server. So if a researcher goes in and hacks into your server, then they can say, oh, here's how I can report how I did this, assuming that that's something that they would like to do. So there is a third type of disclosure that does not involve this sort of private communication, and that is public disclosure. This, from my understanding, comes from basically when researchers have a breakdown in communication, they can't get hold of an organization, or maybe an organization doesn't fulfill their agreement with a coordinated disclosure, and the researcher does what they think is best for potentially the common good, and fully disclose that vulnerability without giving the organization a chance to remediate. And the implication of that, of course, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that then the attackers, as with all CVEs, are made aware of the vulnerability at the exact same time, which means it's a bit of a field day if there is no fix or way to work around this vulnerability. And that is called what's known as a zero-day vulnerability, when there is a flaw without a fix, or it also can be referred to if a flaw exists, but it's not made public, or the organization isn't aware that it exists. So these disclosure processes, just like the process of reporting CVEs, can also be pretty messy. So I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with log4shell. At this point, this was a vulnerability that came out late last year in the Apache log4j package. It was ranked a level 10 on the CVSS scale, which, as we discussed before, is the very highest one. It's because it's highly exploitable and had a really high impact because of the amount of use that this package has, and also just that by simply using it in its default state with the JVM, it could be exploited. And so this one is often talked about as a 0-day disclosure, and you'll see in articles and things like that. And this, actually, the timeline for this was a coordinated disclosure. It was reported by Alibaba to the Apache Foundation, and they came out with a fix. It turned out that they fixed it to the extent of their knowledge, and then, as what happens with many software packages, is when a CVE is found, that draws some attention to that package potentially, and then more hackers go at it, and then more CVEs are filed. So first thing that happened was the fix was not as complete as they thought it would, so it was 0-day for a little while with no fix available, and then 2 or 3 more CVEs within that same month then came out. So it does unfortunately get a little bit messier than that coordinated disclosure. All right, what is the difference between these 2 lines of code? It is just a simple logic error and equal sign, but this too, this single character was just a couple of months ago the cause for another big CVE. And I like this example just to point out that these vulnerabilities are not some big, scary, stupid mistake that people can make. Sometimes, I think all of us have done this probably many times in our careers, we just weren't thinking about an edge case properly one day, maybe. This was one of the OpenSSL vulnerabilities that was publicly disclosed in October. And this was kind of an interesting and unusual disclosure approach as well. So instead of having a coordinated disclosure that came out when it was fixed, OpenSSL said, guys, get ready. There's a critical vulnerability coming. You're going to have to patch next week when we release it. A little bit unfortunately for them, during that week when they were fixing it before it was released, there was more organizations kind of testing out the fix, and it turned out it wasn't quite as bad as they thought it would. So this was an example where, when we talked about that CVSS base rating, for example, sometimes the environment does play a little bit of a factor into that base rating if it's a very, very commonly used environment, for example. And so I think that is what may have happened there, that when this vulnerability came out, it wasn't quite at that critical rating, but it was at a high, I believe, instead. So I find these kind of stories pretty interesting because it kind of brings me into a world that I'm not so familiar with as a software developer. But most of these stories you just don't really hear about at all. In fact, it's estimated that only about a quarter of organizations actually publicly report the vulnerabilities that they're fixing. And only about 10% of those actually end up as CVEs. So it makes it pretty difficult for projects to be able to stay on top of security, since a lot of it is really unknown. And so that kind of brings me into the next section of this presentation, which is how to think about this in a little bit more of a modern way. So one of the issues with the process of a CVE comes out and fixing it is that the time to be able to fix it is typically a lot shorter than it used to be 10, 15 years ago. On average, there used to be about 30 days between when a fix might come out for a vulnerability and somebody would actually try to exploit it. But these days, it's more like a few minutes from when something is publicly disclosed. Not only that, but we're actually seeing a lot more cyber attacks every single year. And unfortunately, for us as developers, yes, there are security professionals to be there to help us, but typically there's an army of us and there's maybe one or none of them, and it's not their job to handhold everything we're doing and basically help us fix it all. So it really is becoming pretty critical that developers are more familiar with these topics. And on top of just being the right thing and not, having your company exploited, it's a lot cheaper to fix a bug, which is often what a security vulnerability is, the earlier in the software development lifecycle it happens. So the first thing, and this isn't particularly modern, but probably the first key thing to know about is that on top of those CVEs, there's also this list of CWEs, and these are basically a way of defining a vulnerability not as a specific system, but instead as like a category. So it's there to provide some education to technical professionals of types of vulnerabilities to be aware of. And the most often times that you'll probably see this is in the OWASP top 10, which is the list of the 10 you should be aware of. But awareness is great, but unfortunately the OWASP top 10 has been basically roughly the same for the last 10 or 15 years, so it's clearly not working super well. Although I do really recommend that you look at these because it is still really important to know them. And the software we use doesn't come oftentimes with a lot of training wheels or guidelines in use. And that's typically a good thing when it comes to innovation and being able to customize solutions, but that's not always the best thing when it comes to security. So I don't know if you've been on Maven Central recently, but if you go in and you look at log4j package, for example, all the vulnerable versions, they're still there. It's up to you to decide whether or not you want to use them. Deserialization exploits are still very possible in the JDK, even though that's been a known issue for a really long time. And so that is a good reason, I think, to consider some help to be able to fix these things. So it's not just the OWASP top 10 against yourself, basically. So one thing that a lot of companies are starting to use is code analysis. So this is really great for code quality, but can also help identify some security issues as well, using static analysis, typically done in like an IDE or pull requests. I think potentially a more important thing to think about, though, is dependency management. There's been, in recent years, a much bigger amount of growth, or a really big amount of growth in dependency management. And I think one of the reasons is because that the impact is much bigger than targeting individual applications or even potentially tools. This is my Niagara Falls example. I'm from Canada, so this is where I live. So as you can see up here, the dependencies are the big falls because downloading a dependency, it goes through every single part of a pipeline, and these get used a lot more by many, many projects as opposed to targeting individual applications. And so there's been like a really huge increase in these supply chain types of attacks, and even not just hackers going out and finding vulnerabilities in a package, but they're kind of creating their own proactive attacks as well. Things like typo squatting, which is basically putting some kind of package that's malicious on something like Maven Central, for example, and then you download it, maybe thinking it's something else, and it could be exploiting your system. Because that's really how valuable these type of attacks can be. But managing dependencies isn't really that easy, unfortunately. So for the average Java project, there's about 150 dependencies on average, and those have about 10 releases a year on average, so that's a lot of updates to consider every single year that could potentially be vulnerable. And I mean, that I think was really shown by the level of remediation we had from the Log4Shell vulnerability last year. So this is some download statistics from Maven Central. And this is, let's see, okay, I think I'm a little bit out of date, but I did check yesterday, and right now there are still 29% of downloads on Maven Central of Log4j that are of those vulnerable versions that are still available. So, you know, we haven't done like a great job remediating. There was quite a lot of effort right at the beginning, but it really leveled off after that last year. And that's not just, you know, a Log4j issue. That's kind of a trend across the industry. So we did a study at Sonatype that's showing that of known vulnerabilities, about 96% of them have a fix available for those projects. However, about 60% of developers are then downloading bad versions or not that they don't need to be otherwise. So we talked a little bit already about managing source code vulnerabilities using things like static analysis tools and OWASP.10, but this part of the code that you don't typically need to interact with, these binaries that are in the systems, are potentially even more important. So that is where tools like static composition analysis come into play. And these types of tools will have the ability, hopefully, to be able to figure out what dependencies are being used in your system. You know, part of the challenge of that Log4Shell remediation that I mentioned earlier was the problem of transitive dependencies. They may not be the Log4j that you think you're using. It could be a Log4j that another dependency you have is using that may be a little bit harder to find and remediate. So that is kind of the value in these types of tools, to be able to say, hey, you actually have several Log4js here, and not all of them are a good version, and be able to provide some recommendations to upgrade those things. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about was, been talking about Maven Central a little bit, but there are some new tools in here too that are also helpful when it comes to dependency management. So it's really great to have these types of tools in software development lifecycle. Recommend everyone do it. But in the meantime, it's also good to know, like, when you're picking a tool, is this going to be a good choice long term for a project? So if you haven't seen it yet, Maven Central got a bit of a makeover last year in the website, and now looks a little bit nicer and more modern. But the things I wanted to point out are towards the bottom, some security features, the Sonatype safety rating, the bomb doctor report, and the OSS index. I didn't make a slide for OSS index because it's not new, but if you're not familiar with it, it is that SCA tool that I mentioned before, and it has open source projects for most major languages, including Java, and something that is possible to run as a command line tool on projects. That's pretty good. The Sonatype safety rating is probably the newest thing. So this was something that we came up with to, like I mentioned before, security today is not so much of a remediation game, but also planning ahead and trying to make the best decisions for the future because of the amount of zero-day vulnerabilities that are out there and likely to be in the future. So this score is intended to predict the likelihood of future vulnerabilities, which is a really hard thing to predict, but they figured out a way to try to do that. So there's two major things that you should know that are in here. The first one is OpenSSF Scorecard. It's an open source project, and it's basically a set of tests that are enforcing some security best practices for open source projects. I've been seeing it a fair bit on projects these days. There's often like a percentage of how complete you are and compliant with the OpenSSF scorecard. It's supposed to be there to show that a project cares about security and they're doing what they can to do that. But it turns out it's also a decent part of a decent predictor in if a project will have vulnerabilities. So the other part of it that came into play is the mean time to update. So it turns out time to update, or how quickly a project is updating their dependencies, also correlates to the amount of time it may take them to remediate a vulnerability. So having a project that can do that really quickly and remediate vulnerability when they have one is definitely a good one to choose. So this is a pretty new thing. I think it's been on the Maven Central website for like 3 months. So if you run an open source project and you see a score up there that you don't like, these are kind of the things to look at. But there's some more details on the Central website too. And feel free to contact us if you need some help there as well. All right, the third thing on Maven Central that you may find interesting in terms of security is the bomb doc that I mentioned. So this is intended to give even more insight into dependencies, and especially those tricky transitive dependencies. So it's something we created you can enter a GitHub link and it will scan your dependencies and make you a little graph, or just try it out with a known one, and it'll show all the transitive dependencies and give them each of them a score. And they're believe based on security, how popular a project is, and the popularity score is of course there because a project with more eyes on it is hopefully going to be more secure. And finally, also legal compliance as well. So if there's some licenses that you may or may not want to use, and then you can play around with it too and do pretend updates to see, how can I improve my score to make myself the safest. Don't go in expecting the scores are out of 500, and I think I've only seen a project rated 500 once in a year. So you're not going to get to 500, but I would say in the green is going to be pretty good. So those are some things looking into the future that I think could be useful to Java projects when choosing some dependencies, and it's just kind of fun to play around with. All right, so, whoops. I'm running very early apparently, but just to recap, so today we talked about the relationships of vulnerability, threat, and risk, CVEs and CVSS scores, the importance of security awareness and tooling, dependency management, and some things that you can look at from Maven Central. And so the takeaway really is that security is really complicated, and there's unfortunately, at least that I see in the future, not a perfect solution to be able to have 100% safe code all the time. But that's not a reason to blow it off and do nothing. something is always a little bit better to move towards safer software. So my call to action to you is, if you're seeing something in this slide that your organization may not be considering, encourage you to be that advocate for security and go back. So these are some things that you may be interested to look at. The top one is some articles that come out every month about security, and they have some interesting stories, sort of like the ones I shared, but better, because it's actual security researchers talking about it. Yeah, and feel free to contact me with any questions. Thank you.
All right, maybe not. Yeah, okay. So I think we have time for a few questions. And
Sure.
so raise your hand and I will run around with the microphone. And yeah, over here.
Hi there. Thank you very much for a great presentation on this important topic. So I was thinking about the open source community. I've been maintaining open source projects myself pretty much in my spare time, and been the sole maintainer of a fairly popular project. I had to fix a CVE at one point as well, but like much of the effort in many open source projects is from people like me, like doing it in the spare time on their own, perhaps. So I'm wondering, do you have any advice for the industry, for us that are open source, like users of open source software? How can we help these projects that, can help, like could benefit from a hand, and when it comes to raising the bar on, security issues or, contributing back? Any advice or thoughts there would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is how to help consumers of open source. How to help the maintainers.
Maintainers, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think one thing that I often see discussed is sort of that, like there's a lot of movement towards securing open source projects and dependencies, but I think as I showed in one of the earlier slides, it's not open source's fault that a lot of projects are not secure. So I think that message is important to remember, that just because a project is open source or potentially done by volunteers, that doesn't mean that it's being done carelessly or by amateurs. So I think, yeah, like guiding people towards more that message, that it's not open source's fault and people are doing the best they can, but it really is up to an organization's standards to be able to say that they're for sure secure. I mean, sort of like with legal compliance, like it's on you to be able to do that. It should be also the same with an organization, like use at your own discretion type of thing. I don't know if that answers a little bit.
All right, other questions? No? Then I think we thank you very much for your presentation, Theresa. It was very interesting and very educating. And yeah, thanks once again, and enjoy your day, everyone.
Thank you.